To the Point with Michael Williams.
A federal jury awarded Dontrell Stevens $23 million, saying Palm Beach County and its sheriff's deputy, Adam Lynn, violated his civil rights when he shot Stevens, paralyzing him in 2013. A federal jury could not reach a verdict just recently in the lawsuit filed by the family of Seth Adams, who claims that PBSO sheriff's deputy Michael Custer used excessive force in the deadly shooting of Adams in 2012. And former Palm Beach Gardens police officer Newman Raja is facing criminal charges in the deadly 2015 shooting of Corey Jones on the side of I-95. Corey Jones, a drummer waiting in his broken down car for help, killed while waiting for that tow truck. Good morning and welcome. We're devoting today's broadcast to the state of law enforcement and community relations in our area because there have been, as we just pointed out, a number of high-profile cases of late. John Kazanjian, president of the Palm Beach County Police Benevolent Association, a familiar face in the community. We thank you for being here. And Stuart Kaplan, a former FBI agent, now an attorney, whose firm has been involved in excessive force cases against law enforcement agencies. We thank you both for coming in and being our guest. Mr. Kazanjian, we'll begin with you. I should note at the outset, we have criminal charges in the Newman Raja case. In the other two cases, there was no finding of criminal charges. We were talking civil cases. That is important to point out that both Seth Adams' case and in the Dontrell Stevens case, there was no finding of criminality involved. Nonetheless, high-profile cases. What's the state of police community relations here right now? And when people bring up these kind of concerns from these cases, what do you say?
Well, I think it's getting a lot better right now, as we can see, because back in 2014, there was a spike in officer-involved shootings. Since 14, we've seen that spike drastically dip down. I think we've only had like 6 shootings that my members, that I represent Martin County and Palm Beach County, last year we only had 6 officer-involved shootings.
What do you attribute that to?
I'm going to contribute that to 2 things, Mike. I'm going to contribute that to the community, the awareness in the community, and I'm going to say thanks to the media, because the media has put all these shootings out there because everything's on video now. So the community sees the videos of all these shootings, and by the media presenting that to the community, what we see is compliance, because that's all we ask from when we have a contact with someone. Just comply. And if you comply, you can complain later. And guess what? You can go home, you know, once these charges are done, you can go home. But once you don't comply, the fight's on. And we know if you use force, if we have to use force, it's ugly.
Mr. Kaplan, your take, same question.
I'm not so sure I necessarily agree with what is attributing to the decline in the shootings that certainly were more pervasive going back last year and the year before. But I will say this, I think that the sheriff's office as a whole is making a much greater effort to ensure that its men and women of law enforcement are getting the proper training. And I also see that I think they're doing a better job in the screening process with respect to prospective candidates. Personally, it's somewhat disappointing. All of the cases that I have been involved in, which are numerous, and most of the more high-profile type of cases that we have been involved in, there has been one common theme. Either the applicant himself or herself should never have been employed in the first place, meaning that the screening process was not to the standards that you would expect for bringing someone into law enforcement, or that there were so many indicators through that person's career, many red flags, numerous incidents that should have made the supervisors and the executive staff concerned about this particular person staying employed. And I think now they're realizing to safeguard and to ensure that the applicants and the people that are employed are in fact getting the necessary training, or in fact being disciplined or terminated.
What about that critique about the concerns about training?
I respectfully disagree with Mr. Kaplan, because on my second one, besides compliance, that the community, you know, sees that we're involved with, it's also not specifically training, but some policies that the sheriff and other agencies have put into place. We have what we call a tactical pause. Before, if a call came out as a domestic, we were going, All right, you were one car, you weren't waiting for backup, and then things happen. Now we're doing what we call a tactical pause. Wait for your backup, wait till you get other people there, and then you handle the situation. So by Mr. Kaplan saying that we got bad candidates, I disagree with him on that.
Well, in an entire force, can you not concede, and we've certainly done stories, that there are some cases where you look back at records and say, is this somebody meet the standards you'd want to see among the best of the best, which is what we want on all of our forces, whatever department they're in.
I've been doing this 30 years, and you're right, we're going to have some bad apples out there. But we weed them out. We do weed them out. But I don't think any of these shootings that we've had in the last, say, 8 years, I haven't seen one bad apple.
You know, Mike, I will just put it this way, without commenting in great detail in a case that just recently happened on back in December, the Ricky Wheaton shooting. There's an individual who was in an emotional state of crisis. In fact, it took over 35 or almost 40 minutes for the Sheriff's Department to respond. And notwithstanding that within the 35 or 40 minutes, Mr. Wheaton did not, in fact, commit suicide, it took less than a minute for him to be shot and killed.
For those who don't know, ends up being a confrontation. The deputy said he was concerned that he was being come after. There's been a videotape released where you argued the young man who you say had emotional issues was departing the scene or trying to get away, was shot. The case is going on right now, which is, by the way, why some agencies, including PBSO and Palm Beach Gardens, would like to have them here. They cannot comment on ongoing cases, so they were invited. I wanted to make that point. But your argument is that's the kind of case that could have been handled a whole lot differently.
A whole lot different and a whole lot better. And you know, and listen, and I've been on record, 99.9% of the men and women who get up each and every day to do such a heroic job to keep us safe are amazing people. But there is, as Mr. Kazanjian actually concedes, there are some bad apples. The question is, what do we do with those bad apples? Do we keep them in place, or do we weed them out and terminate them?
And in your mind, not enough yet in total is being done in that regard.
That is my position.
And you disagree with that?
I do, because we do weed them out. Listen, I represent 5,000 members. All right, I go to arbitrations, I go to court hearings where our members get terminated, and some of them rightfully so, and I won't represent them. And those are the ones that we weed out. But for the last 8 years, these shootings that we have, I disagree. I mean, there wasn't one bad apple in any of these shootings.
Let's talk about the shootings, because it's always dangerous to extrapolate too much from these situations, which are traumatic and heartrending for victims and their families, traumatic for the deputy or police officer involved as well. So we want to be careful there. PBSO, for instance, said last year, total number of calls for service, 1.2 million. Total arrest, about 36,000. Out of that, they said the use of force was 560, only a small part of the total number of arrests. So you have that stat and that backdrop. On the other hand, you have the publicity about these huge cases. Dontrell Stevens, broad daylight, did not have a weapon. He's paralyzed for life. Seth Adams, case just wrapped up, may go back to trial. Again, ended up being a hung jury. Even the federal judge in that case, out of earshot of the jury, said he was not happy with the way the investigation had been conducted and couldn't believe it. Those cases resonate with the public. When you talk about training, talking about making sure you have the right people in the right job, against the backdrop of those cases, how do you make that case?
Well, all I can comment on the cases, the Seth Adams case, that's over.
At least for now.
It is. But Sergeant Custer, Sergeant Lynn, it's their perception. And Mr. Kaplan knows that. He's an attorney.
And a former FBI agent.
Sure he is, yes. And the Supreme Court has said it's their perception. And you can't Monday morning quarterback their perception. If they feel that there's a threat, or, you know, if there's going to be any harm to them or someone else, they can use deadly force. And they thought, you know, Sergeant Lynn thought he was reaching for a gun, and it happened to be a phone. But that happens. We hear that all the time.
You know, Mike, let me jump in here, because I'm going to just tell you, and I respectfully disagree with the way he's articulating. Every single case that my office has been involved in, every single case, without an exception, the officer within minutes or within hours gives a interview statement. It's usually what's called a reenactment. He walks through the crime scene and shows exactly what happens. Notwithstanding that the physical evidence has not been retrieved or gathered or analyzed or sent out for processing. Once that DNA or that forensic analysis or that physical evidence is finally connected, maybe days, weeks, years later, every single case that I've had shows without a shadow of a doubt that what the officer said within minutes or within hours of what happened is completely inconsistent with the physical evidence. And that's what my problem is. My problem is that he's locked in, the deputy's locked into the story. We know that there's video, or we know that there's physical evidence that completely contradicts what the officer is trying to suggest. And notwithstanding, the sheriff's office never ever goes out and tries to re-interview the deputy or go out and re-interview the witnesses to show or to try to suggest why are there inconsistencies. They live and die with the original statement and do nothing to contradict it.
In the Seth Adams case, and I want you to completely respond, the federal judge was critical himself. A federal judge, again, out of earshot of the jury, was himself critical about the investigation done in the Seth Adams death. As an example, your response.
Mr. Kaplan brings up the reenactments. We don't do reenactments anymore, just because what Mr. Kaplan said. You got a civil attorney looking at a reenactment an hour after someone shoots someone, kills them. And the agency and the state attorney want us, our members, to do a reenactment. There have been studies that says that you need at least 4 sleep cycles before you do an interview. So we have stopped doing all these reenactments on video because of the civil attorneys. They get them and they punch holes into all these allegations.
Let me ask as we move forward in our last few minutes, because it's certainly a topic we want to touch on. It's not one we're going to solve here today. As I said at the outset and took pains to say, the overwhelming majority, as you both concede, of encounters with the public go off peacefully. There are high-profile cases that have shaken the community and continue to do so. We've talked a bit about that. Going forward, outside of more training, you both agree we can even do more. You can always do more with training. PBSO, as one agency, argues it's doing that. Your position on body cams, and also your general position on the proactive things you all are doing in terms of outreach into the communities, whether it's the Hispanic community, the African-American community, or beyond. First you, and then Mr. Kaplan.
Listen, we, the PBA, we don't have a problem with any body cameras. However, 2 things I want to mention. I do not want to see the purchase of body cameras interfere with my members' wages and benefits, all right? Because the sheriff or West Palm Beach or another agency has to go get body cameras. I don't want them taking a pay cut or anything like that, or health care, all right? That's number 1. Number 2 is it's not the cure-all. It's one-dimensional. One-dimensional. Everybody watches the NFL every Sunday. They spend millions of dollars on these cameras. They can't even get it right.
So I want to be clear. Are you generally supportive of them if it can be fit into a budget without hurting pay and benefits?
Yes, but I just want to let the public know it's not a cure-all.
And then what else, and then I'll let you have the closing word on body cams and the like. What other things do you see that your agencies are doing around the county in terms of proactive outreach to the community to try and engender even better bonds of community support? We hear nationwide about the lack of trust between many African-American communities and their police agencies. In candor, there are communities here that have complained about that as well as around the nation. What proactively is being done in those communities around Palm Beach County?
Well, I know us in the PBA, we're getting into the community just with our board of directors, and we're doing a lot of charity events. And we're raising a lot of money and helping these kids out to go to, to further education.
On body cameras and what else you'd like to see, whether it's training or community outreach to help build bonds between police and their communities. A lot of that's being done with athletic leagues and the like, but your final take on all of that, beginning with body cams.
Ironically, I agree with Mr. Kazanjian with respect to the body cameras. My experience, my own personal experience and my experience with my training and seeing body cameras, when something does in fact happen, a officer generally will have tunnel vision. He will forget about the fact that he has body cameras. I don't think it will interfere with what his decision making is or is not. I'm not so sure whether or not it is a deterrence for the use of force. But what I will say is, for example, we know in the Dontrell Stevens case that Dontrell Stevens had a cell phone. Where in the United States of America can anybody have a job and make such a mistake as making a mistake as a cell phone versus a weapon and put an individual in a wheelchair for the rest of his life without any accountability whatsoever. It's a mistake, but it's a mistake that went unaccountable for.
Well, a civil jury awarded him $23 million, so there was accountability, not in a criminal sense, but a civil jury did award him money. So.
But there is the argument that because he over-pursued someone, or the fact that Dontrell Stevens at best committed jaywalking, was on a bicycle, had a cell phone in his hand, that's indisputable. The evidence speaks for itself, and my position is, I believe that the deputy, in fact, should not continue to be a law enforcement officer.
Literally final 20 seconds on what we can do to move forward. Again, we don't want to extrapolate too much from any one or two or three cases, as much publicity as they've gotten, as to what's happening in the wider community. But how do we bridge that gap between these high-profile cases and the fact that 99% are out doing their jobs? And how do we bridge the trust gap that may still exist for many? A final brief comment.
Mike, I think we have. 2 years ago, we spiked. We're coming way down.
Mike, my position is you got to hold everybody to the same standard and hold people accountable. And when you hold people accountable, when a good officer makes a mistake, we can give him the benefit of the doubt. But when you give everybody a pass, even the good officers are going to be over-scrutinized.
Mr. Kaplan, Mr. Kazanjian, a debate that will go on, but a worthy one. We appreciate both of your perspectives as guests and familiar faces in this community. Thanks for being with us today on To The Point. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
A debate and discussion that goes on, and next we'll have the views of a local civil rights group.